My predictions are coming out a bit late, but I've had time in the lab to do all of the research so you don't have to do it and give you the right answers here so you can get 9 out of 9. But first, I want to tell you about the online bootcamp I'm running with Gosu Academy to help you become a better player. This is a 10-day course with tasks, accountability, feedback directly from me, and most importantly, other players with similar mindsets that you can network with and potentially play with in the future. Look, the reality is everything that you need to know about CS is out there on the web for free, but it's the learning that's the hard part. And the reason I agreed to run this bootcamp is specifically because they're proven to be more effective ways of learning, and YouTube can often have a bit of an information overload that makes it hard to truly improve. So I do genuinely recommend you check out the bootcamp, and worst case scenario, after a couple of days, if you didn't enjoy it, you can get a refund. So when it actually comes down to it, there's a bunch of very obvious choices, and then the 0-3 and the 3-0 choices are where it gets a little bit interesting, and maybe the final choice for teams that get through could have a little bit of leeway. But I actually think there's a couple of things that make a pretty big difference, because the matchups actually, in my opinion, are really going to decide what teams actually make it through to 0-3, what teams successfully lose every game in the event. So the obvious teams that pretty much everyone has are these ones. Pretty much everyone agrees these teams are going to go through, but I'm actually going to give you guys a little bit of insight here. There is a Challenger Stage predictions by GG Predict.io, and nobody seems to give them too much of the time of day. However, last major, if you chose what they were choosing, were like 8 out of 9 or something. They were very consistent in how effective their choices were. And they actually have Astralis as they're most likely to go through, which seems crazy to me, but whatever. But the next time around, if you're looking to make simple predictions, GG Predict is a decent one, but they actually have Fours as the third most likely team to go through. And Liquid is around 50% with Eternal Fire. Now, I'm not sure I fully agree with that. However, when I was looking at teams, it's really a massive toss-up between Fours, Eternal Fire, Spirit. Those three teams all seem like they could definitely make it, and Bad News Eagles as well isn't as likely, but it's certainly a team that has a lot of potential. So if I'm going to have to pick a team, we're going to have to put Fours in here. And then obviously wondering about the 3-0, if you weren't already aware of this, but most people are, usually you put a 3-0 team that you think isn't going to go 3-0, because then if a team that is going to advance, like Astralis or G2, if they don't go 3-0, then you don't get the point at all, and you essentially lose 2 points. So instead, what you do is you put a team like whoever you think one of the borderline teams is, and you put them as your 3-0 choice. And I was thinking Spirit, certainly a reasonable choice. Eternal Fire, also a reasonable choice. But I think what we're going to go for here, because, it feels like these teams, we're pretty certain that we're going to get this, we're going to figure this out. So we're going for the 9-0. We're going for the 9-pointer. And in order to go for the 9-pointer, I think in this case, we're putting ENTS as 3-0. And we're putting Eternal Fire as the final team in the list here. We're going for the 9-0, and when we go for the 0-3, this is what I was talking about. We do actually have to look down at the matchup calculator, because I think this actually makes a pretty big difference in which team is going to advance and which team isn't. So if we look at this matchup calculator here, if the generally favored teams win in the first round, you're actually going to see it's very obvious who ends up into the second round. You've got Spirit versus Imperial Esports and BNE versus Eternal Fire, which could both go kind of either way. I think I'll have to give it to Spirit and Eternal Fire, in which case you've got BNE versus Renegades, and you've got Complexity versus IHC. And BNE is a clear favorite over Renegades, whereas Complexity IHC, I think a lot of people, there's a bit of an NA bias just in the community in general that you see on Reddit especially, but I think a lot of some NA bias just in terms of how many matches you're seeing from NA as opposed to Asia. And I found that typically the Asian team, I think they've only gone 0-3 like once since 2015, whereas the NA teams are typically a bit overrated. And Complexity, the problem with Complexity is they could do really well if some of their players light up, but they could also, if Grim doesn't show up for a game, they can just lose. If Floppy doesn't show up for a game, they could just lose. And I'm sorry to say, typically Junior, he can show up against teams like IHC, but if IHC is doing well and hitting their shots, I think he could also kind of fail to perform. So I think this game is a bit of a 50-50 almost. I think Complexity probably has a bit of an advantage, but could go either way. And so you have, if we talk about the favorites mostly winning in these games here, MIBR 9Z, I think could go either way. Vitality Astralis could go either way. This calculator works really well for the first round, somewhat for the second round. But if we're just looking at, which teams I feel like are probably going to win here, you're seeing Renegades versus Complexity is a fairly likely matchup. And then if you just change it up a little bit, it's Renegades versus 9Z. And I think Renegades aren't favored in either of those matchups, certainly not against Complexity, I think. But I don't think they're favored in either of those matchups. So I think given the way that these matchups are going, I think you have to say that IHC is more likely to win because both of their games at 0-1 and 0-2 are notably pretty winnable, whereas Renegades is either playing basically Bad News Eagles or they're playing Eternal Fire. Both teams that should handily beat Renegades, and then they only have a bit of a toss-up once they're already 0-2. So when it comes down to it in that case, I think Renegades have to be the 0-2 choice, even if you think they're equal or maybe even slightly worse than IHC. I don't think you can say that IHC is the obvious choice to go 0-3, even though pretty much everyone else seems to be putting IHC as their 0-3 choice. I think it's, people just want to put the Asian team as 0-3, and they rarely go 0-3, even though, maybe they're a bit weaker this time around. We're going for 9-0. This is the list. This is the 9-0 list. You go 9-0 if you pick this list. We've compiled all the data. We've got GG Predict. We've got everything down. If you want to go 9-0, but maybe not advance if things go really poorly, okay, because that's always on the table. You pick this. But if you're trying for optimal advanced chances, right? Like optimally, you're trying to definitely get through, which is all you need to do for this pick'em. You don't get anything special for going 9-0 unless you're making a video and you want bragging points. By the way, it would be even funnier if I didn't make it through. That's the whole reason I'm doing this. But if you wanted to do that, you just change these two teams and you're good to go. So catch you for the next one.